Hi. In this episode, we're going to show how you can enable your assistant to collect information from a user. One of the most common conversational patterns is to collect a few pieces of information from a user in order to do something. Book a restaurant, call an API, search a database, that kind of thing. This process is also called slot filling, and Rasa Forms makes this easy. Before diving into the syntax though, let's start with a simple example that explains the task that we are interested in. Let's say that we have a user that's saying, I want to buy a pizza. The assistant can pick up that there's an intent, and it can try to run a custom action on behalf of the user, but the assistant will need some extra information. What toppings does the user want to have on their pizza? What size should the pizza be? Before we can actually trigger the custom action in order to order the pizza, we need to know this extra information first. Let's consider a slightly different scenario. Suppose now that the user said, I want to buy a large pizza. This time around, the user is giving us more information. We know now that the user wants to buy a pizza and a large one, but we still need to ask the user about the toppings of the pizza. When designing a conversation, you'd like to remain flexible. The user might not immediately give you all the information that you're interested in, so at times you'd like to be able to ask for more. But at the same time, you also don't want to ask for details all the time, especially if the user already gave you that information. And I hope you can imagine that there are many ways for our user to order a pizza, so that means that we need to have a building block that is flexible enough to tell us when information is missing. In Rasa open source, you want to use Rasa Forms for these scenarios. A Rasa form is this building block. You can configure Rasa Forms to fetch the relevant information from the conversation. You can use Rasa Forms also to validate this information, and the forms will then also store this information in long-lived slots that you can use in the rest of the conversation. So let's discuss how Rasa Forms work conceptually, and we'll use the same example as we used before. There is a user that is interested in buying a pizza, and we can assume that we have an intent for ordering a pizza. So when a user says, I want to buy a pizza, we have a rule at our disposal that we can use to trigger the start of a form. Now, conceptually, we could now say that there's a form active. And an active form can be thought of as a loop that will keep asking for information that's missing. It keeps asking the user for information until all the slots are filled in. And in this case, we first ask the user for the type of pizza they'd like to have, and we can have a response ready to ask for both of these pieces of information. So let's assume that the first response from the assistant is asking about the kind of pizza that they might be interested in. The user can then respond by saying that they're interested in ordering a veggie pizza. And in this case, the user responded with a piece of text that contains an entity. Rasa Forms can be configured to detect slot values from these entities. So at this point in the conversation, the state of the Rasa form can update. The form is not done though. There's still a slot missing, namely the one for the size of the pizza. So the form will trigger another question for the user, and this time the assistant can send a response asking about the size of the pizza. And again, the user will respond, and let's assume the user responds by saying large. And in this case, large can again be picked up as an entity. The form can pick up this information and update the internal state. At this point in the for loop, the form will recognize that there are no more slots to ask for. The form has all the information it needs, and that means that the form can become inactive. Once a form is inactive, the dialog manager kicks back in to predict the next action it take. And in this case, we might configure a rule to perform the pizza ordering custom action. Rasa Forms make it easy for you to configure this exact loop. To configure a form in Rasa, you will need to set two rules in your rules.yaml file. One rule will activate the pizza form, and another one will deactivate it once all the slots are filled in. Here's an example of what such rules might look like. Note that we're not just triggering an action here, we're also triggering a loop called simple pizza form. And pay attention to the requested slot value in the second rule. When the requested slot is equal to null, then we know the form is done. Once the form is done, we can also trigger custom actions to use the data that's been saved in the slots. Now, let's go over everything that's happening in our conversation one more time. Now that we've gotten an example of the state of a form during a conversation, there are a few things to observe conceptually. Once a form is triggered, it will automatically ask for required slots. And as the designer of the assistant, you'll need to define what information is required, but you don't need to write stories on how the assistant is asking for information. The form will act as a loop, and as long as the form is active, it will keep asking for values that are supposed to go in the empty slots. Parts of the form can also be customized. This particular form is retrieving slot values from entities, but we can also retrieve them from the text directly. We can also customize how the assistant asks for this information from each slot. And we can even use custom actions to validate the data that we get in. The Rasa form will also only ask for information that the user hasn't provided yet. If the form is triggered and the user gives extra information, then the form won't repeat itself. Now, to demonstrate this last part, let's now suppose the conversation went a little bit differently. If the user starts a form by saying, "I want to have a veggie pizza," then the rule will trigger the form loop, but the form will also be able to recognize that a pizza type entity is around. So that means it can already fill in a slot, and therefore it won't need to ask for this information anymore. And this is great because it means that the form will be shorter, saving the user some time. In this case, you only need to follow up by asking about the size of the pizza, and there's no need to ask for information that we already know. Forms can also be configured to check the input from a user. Let's say that we've just started the form, and we're asking the user what kind of pizza they would like to order. The user might say that they're interested in a fruit pizza. And in this case, even if fruit is detected as an entity, we would really like the assistant to recognize that such a pizza isn't up for sale, it doesn't exist. And that's why Rasa allows you to write custom actions that will validate the form input. If the input from the user is invalid, then we can prevent a slot from being set, and we'll get the opportunity to ask the user again by giving it some more information as well. Rasa forms can help you automate the process of setting slots, but you will still need to think about how your user would like to interact with your assistant. It might be better, for example, to tell the user upfront which pizzas are available. That way, you might be able to save them some time, and you won't bother the user with an extra validation step. We also need to keep in mind that if we're setting slots by detecting entities, that we're also dependent on our entity extraction algorithms. So that's also why it tends to help to omit entities that are very hard to detect. Now that we've done this introduction, what I would like to do for the remainder of the video is show you a live coding section where I implement the form that I've just mentioned. We're going to talk about how to set up the form, and we're also going to emphasize how you can use custom actions to validate the form inputs. So let's show a small demo. What you're looking at here is a Rasa project in Visual Studio Code that I started by running Rasa init. I then made a few adjustments so I can demonstrate how forms work. The first thing that I changed is I added two intents to my nlu.yaml file. I added a intent that allows me to declare that I'm interested in buying a pizza, and I also added another intent that I called inform that allows me to put all of my examples of entities in a single place. The main thing that I'm doing here, though, is I'm making sure that there's a place where my examples for all of my entities can live. There's the pizza size entity, as well as the pizza type entity, and all of my examples can be found here. Given that I have some training data, the next thing that I needed to do was add some rules. The two rules that I've added are the activate pizza form rule and the submit pizza form rule. It's this rule that will start the form for me. Whenever the buy pizza intent is detected, the simple pizza form is activated, and there's a loop that's active as well from that point. This rule handles the submission of the form. Given that there's a pizza form active, if we ever notice that we are no longer in need of requesting extra slots, then the form will stop and we can say, well, now we want to run the utter submit action as well as the utter pizza slots action. What you see here are the rules that I need to activate and deactivate my form. But the definition of the form itself is not in the rules file. That is something that we configure in the domain.yaml file. So let's have a look at everything added to the domain file. I have an intent, request pizza form, that had to be added. I'm also using two entities, pizza size and pizza type. Both of those have to be defined. But from there, I also need to have slots. The idea here is that an entity is something that's detected in a current message, but this slot here refers to something that I'm storing for the long term, something that lasts longer than just a single message. What you can also see is that I'm using slot mappings over here, and that's a way for me to specify that this particular slot is set by this particular entity. And this is also how they are linked. What you can also confirm here is that the pizza size is of type text, and that it can also influence the conversation. When I scroll down a little bit, you will also see the second slot. You will also notice that there's another correspondence with an entity, and it's these two slots that will be used in a form, which I've defined below. I have a simple pizza form defined over here, and it requires two slots. First, it'll ask for the pizza size, and then it will ask for the pizza type. And note that there is a correspondence between the name here and the name here. At this point, it is good to know that we are using entities for our slot mappings here, but you are also able to fill in a slot using text or intents. And if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you check out the documentation. Given that we have our form defined, we can now start thinking about responses that are relevant. For example, here I have my utter pizza slots response, and you'll notice that I'm actually using slot values to generate some text to return to the user. I also have these two responses, which follow a naming convention. You'll notice that both of these follow the utter underscore ask underscore slot name convention. And this is a way for me to customize the way that I'm asking the user to fill in a slot. And this is great because it allows me to customize the experience just a bit. Finally, you'll also notice that I have added some actions below. And the one that I would like to zoom in on is this validate pizza form action. You may again notice that there is indeed a naming convention happening here. Validate underscore and then the name of a form. And this action is a custom action that allows me to validate the input in this form using some custom Python code. And we can actually find the custom action that it's referring to by checking the actions.py file. In my actions.py file, I have a validate simple pizza form. And it's very much like a custom action, but it's a specific kind of custom action. I am inheriting not from the base action class, but instead I am inheriting from the form validation action. From here, we recognize that there's a name attached to this form validator, and this name corresponds with our setting in our domain.yaml file. But inside of this form validator, I can validate both the size of the pizza slot as well as the type of the pizza slot. And again, Rasa also makes use of a naming convention here. The method needs to be called validate underscore, and then the name of the slot should be attached after it. If we have a quick look at how we've implemented the validator for the pizza size, then you'll notice that we're always returning a dictionary. If the value of the passed slot is not in the set of allowed pizza sizes, then first we're going to send the user a message saying that we only accept specific sizes, and then we're going to return a dictionary. The dictionary says that the pizza size is equal to none, which tells Rasa that we've not been able to validate the value that the user gave us. If that's not the case, then we're going to tell the user, okay, we agree with the slot value, and then we're going to return a dictionary where the pizza size actually has a value attached. And this is how we can validate data. If we return a dictionary with a value of none, then the data is invalid. And if the data is valid, we can just return a dictionary with an appropriate value attached. And we're doing a very similar thing here in the validate pizza type. Also here, we are keeping track of a list of allowed types, and if the pizza type is not in there, we return none, and otherwise we just return the slot value. Let's now do a quick demo of this behavior. What you see here are two terminal windows open. In this terminal window, I am running the Rasa run actions command. I need to do that because the form validation over here is an action, so I do need a separate action service running. Over here, I'm now going to start up my Rasa interactive shell so we can see what happens when we activate a form. And I'll also go ahead and make the shell a bit bigger. So here's a Rasa interactive session just before triggering the form. If I now type, I want to buy a pizza, we see that the buy pizza intent is triggered, and that means that the rule that I've configured earlier should now trigger the simple pizza form. There's a few things to point out at this phase. We can see that indeed the simple pizza form is now active as a loop. We can also see that there is a slot called requested slot that's triggered, and it's indicating that we are interested in asking about the pizza size. We can also confirm that by looking here. The idea is that we have this slot called requested slot that's around to keep track of what we are asking the user. And this form is starting by asking about the size of the pizza that the user is interested in. So what I could now do is I could type something like, I want a large pizza. And when I pass this to the assistant, we are detecting an entity. We are detecting that large is a pizza size. So that's correct. And we can now also see that the form has picked this information up and that a slot has indeed been set. The slot set event is shown here in the conversation, but we can also see that the current slot value is large. And the conversation is moving on because the simple pizza form loop is still active, and this is still correct. Let's now see if we can have the validator trigger. Let's say that I'm interested in a veggie pizza with a misspelling. In this case, veggie with 3 G's is indeed detected as an entity, but it won't be in the allowed pizza types list. So let's see what happens. We can see that the validator message that we've set here is indeed being shown here. We are telling the user that there's only a couple of pizzas that we sell, and we also see that the pizza type slot has been set to none. That's the event that's being passed in here. What the form then does is it recognizes that a slot hasn't been set yet, and it will then proceed by asking the user again what kind of pizza they would like. And this is nice because that means that we only get the information that we're interested in our form. If I were now to say that I'm interested in just a veggie pizza, spelled correctly, the form should proceed just fine. We can see the entity being detected, and we can indeed see the slot set event here, and we can confirm that the pizza type slot is indeed set. What's going to happen now is the form is going to recognize that it's done. There are no more slots to request. So that means that the active loop is shutting down, and what happens next is defined in our rules.yaml file. We are done with the form that's happening here, which means that the other submit and the other pizza slots actions will follow. And there you go. This is how a form with validation handles the conversation inside of Rasa. And now that we've done the demo, let's wrap up for this video. In this video, we've learned about Rasa forms. And in short, if you ever want to collect data in Rasa open source in a conversation, then Rasa forms are definitely the way to go. They automate the process of retrieving information from the user, and they even allow you to validate the data programmatically. That said, they won't solve everything for you. You will still need to think about conversational design in order to keep the forms convenient for your users. Having said that, in this video, we've really only been scratching the surface. We've introduced Rasa forms, but there are even more customizations that we can consider. So in the next video, we'll go into more depth so that we can see how we can further customize Rasa forms. I hope you'll stay tuned for that.